What if the most feared figure of Auschwitz wasn't a man with a gun, but a 19-year-old girl with a smile? She didn't shout. She didn't beg for power. She walked silently, and thousands trembled. Why did prisoners call her the Hyena of Auschwitz? And what chilling words did she speak before the rope tightened around her neck? In the frozen silence of Auschwitz, death had many faces. Most wore the uniforms of men, officers, guards, soldiers with rifles slung across their shoulders. But among them walked a figure who shattered every expectation of cruelty. She was young, barely out of her teenage years, blonde hair tied neatly back, blue eyes that revealed nothing. And yet her presence alone was enough to make thousands tremble. Prisoners lowered their gaze. Even other guards kept their distance. She carried no whip at times, no raised voice, no display of fury. Instead, she moved slowly between the barracks, boots crunching against the gravel, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For those condemned behind the wire, that smile was more terrifying than the sound of gunfire. They called her the Hyena of Auschwitz. To the world, she became a symbol of innocence, twisted into something monstrous, Irma Grese. What made her terrifying was not only what she did, but how she did it. Cold, detached, almost playful in her cruelty. Survivors remembered her standing silently as dogs ripped a man apart. Others recalled how she forced women to endure humiliation in the bitter snow. She rarely shouted, she rarely hesitated, and she never flinched. It was the calmness, the eerie satisfaction that marked her apart from every other name on the long list of war criminals. As the Third Reich collapsed, her name echoed in fear, not for her rank, not for her power, but for the way she wielded authority like a blade, cutting into the spirit of all who crossed her path. This is the story of Irma Grese, how a young woman became one of history's most chilling figures, and how the world demanded she pay for the shadows she cast. Irma Grese was born in October 1923 in a small rural town in northern Germany. At first glance, her beginnings seemed ordinary, the life of a farmer's daughter in a countryside still reeling from the scars of the First World War. But behind the simplicity of the fields and barns, shadows already gathered. When she was only 13 years old, her mother took her own life. The girl who would one day terrify thousands was left staring into the abyss of loss before she was even grown. Her father was a strict man, unyielding, devoted to Hitler, intolerant of weakness. In his household, compassion was scarce. Discipline was absolute. For young Irma, grief was not met with comfort, but with silence and rigid expectations. The fragile foundations of her childhood cracked, leaving behind a hardness that only deepened with time. She left school early, too restless, too eager to find purpose in a nation consumed by propaganda. At first, she sought work as a nurse's assistant. To the outside eye, it might have seemed a path of care. But this was Nazi Germany. Hospitals and clinics were not just about healing. They were already entwined with ideology, with programs that divided lives into those worth saving and those marked for destruction. By the age of 18, Grese had found her way into the machinery of power. She volunteered for the SS auxiliary units. Not under pressure, not by force. She chose it. To her, it was an opportunity for status, for belonging, for recognition in a world that offered little to a poor farmer's daughter. In 1942, she arrived at Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp. Here she was trained not in medicine, not in compassion, but in control and cruelty. Witnesses later described how quickly she adapted to the environment, how easily she learned to command, to punish, to enforce discipline with an icy stare. Ravensbrück hardened her, but it was only a prelude. Soon she was transferred to Auschwitz. The name itself was already synonymous with death. For Irma Grese, it was the stage upon which her transformation would be completed. At just 19 years old, she entered the gates of the camp that devoured more than 1 million lives. Most guards dreaded service there. She did not. Survivors remembered her striding through the barracks, leather boots polished, uniform sharp, eyes surveying the prisoners as if they were not human beings, but objects of control. What makes her story chilling is not just the setting, but the contrast. She was young. She was beautiful by the standards of her time. A woman who, under different circumstances, might have lived an unremarkable life, working on a farm, marrying, raising children. Instead, she embraced the ideology that glorified domination, that dehumanized the weak, that gave her the power to harm without consequence. It was not only ideology, it was opportunity. Within the SS, Grese found authority she could never have imagined in civilian life. Male officers praised her loyalty. Fellow female guards saw her as ambitious, rising quickly through the ranks. In a system built on cruelty, she excelled. By 1943, she was no longer a simple assistant. She was a full-fledged guard, patrolling with dogs, feared by thousands. The little girl abandoned by her mother had grown into a figure prisoners would describe as a walking nightmare. She had become part of the very architecture of horror. The journey from a broken childhood to the gates of Auschwitz is not just biography. It is the anatomy of corruption. A society twisted by war and ideology had given a young woman the means to unleash her darkest impulses. And once the opportunity was placed before her, she never looked back. When Irma Grese first walked through the gates of Ravensbrück, she was only a teenager. The camp was infamous, a place built for women labeled enemies of the Reich, political prisoners, Jews, resistance fighters. It was here that she received her true initiation. Guards were trained not in discipline alone, but in domination. Prisoners were reduced to numbers. Compassion was stripped away, replaced by routines of humiliation and pain. For Grese, the transition seemed effortless. She absorbed the lessons quickly, as if cruelty was not foreign but natural. Survivors later recalled her cold gaze, her straight posture, the way she studied the faces of women lined up in fear. She was not yet the notorious figure she would become, but the seeds had been planted. Within months, she was no longer the uncertain recruit. She had become an enforcer, a presence that other guards acknowledged with respect and prisoners dreaded to encounter. By 1943, she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The name alone carried the weight of death. Here, the machinery of mass murder operated on a scale the world had never seen. Gas chambers, crematoria, endless trains delivering victims. For many SS auxiliaries, service at Auschwitz was unbearable. But for Irma Grese, it was a stage. She stepped into her role with chilling ease. At just 19, she patrolled the women's camp. Survivors described the sight of her. Black leather boots polished, a pistol at her side, and sometimes a riding crop in her hand. More terrifying than the weapons was her expression. Calm, almost indifferent, as if she were walking through a garden instead of a field of human suffering. One prisoner remembered the sound of her footsteps in the gravel. It was enough to silence a crowd. When she appeared, the survivor said, we stopped breathing. She rarely needed to shout. She ruled through presence, through the knowledge that she could end a life with nothing more than a glance and a nod. Her power extended beyond punishment. She controlled work assignments. She oversaw selections, where prisoners were divided, those who might live to labor and those who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. For the women who stood before her, Greece was fate itself. Their survival, or their death, could hinge on her whim. What disturbed many survivors most was not only the violence, but the strange satisfaction she seemed to take in it. Accounts describe her unleashing dogs on prisoners who faltered in line. Others remembered her forcing women to stand naked in the freezing air, watching with a faint smile as they shivered, collapsed, or begged for mercy. Each detail returned again and again in testimony. Her composure, her smirk, the absence of hesitation. Even among fellow guards, she stood out. Some feared her, others admired her commitment. To male SS officers, she was proof that even a young woman could embody the ruthless efficiency demanded by the Reich. She wore that recognition like a badge. For Irma Grese, Auschwitz was not a burden. It was an arena in which she thrived. But behind the terror, questions linger. Was she driven purely by ideology? By loyalty to the Reich? Or was there something deeper? A personal hunger for authority? A satisfaction in power she had never known in her youth? Survivors spoke of the way she laughed, softly, almost girlishly, after acts of cruelty. That laugh haunted them more than the blows, more than the barking of dogs. It was the sound of a human being enjoying the pain of others. By 1944, her reputation was sealed. Prisoners whispered her name like a curse. She was no longer just a guard. She was a figure of dread, a symbol of the camp's merciless order. And yet, outside the wire, she was still so young, barely 20 years old. A face that might have belonged to a schoolgirl, now etched into memory as one of the most terrifying presences of the Holocaust. The world would later ask how such transformation was possible, how a girl from a village, a teenager barely grown, could step so fully into the role of executioner. At Auschwitz, the answer was not hidden. It was played out day after day, in the silence of the barracks, in the fear that spread whenever she appeared. For those who survived, Irma Grese was not simply a guard. She was the embodiment of cruelty itself. At Auschwitz, Irma Grese's reputation grew into legend. Dark, terrible, unforgettable. She was no longer just another female guard. She had become a figure of terror, her presence alone enough to freeze entire blocks of prisoners into silence. Survivors would later describe her as a shadow gliding between the barracks, boots echoing against the gravel, a faint smile dancing on her lips as if she were strolling through a theater of cruelty. Her weapon was not only the pistol at her side or the whip in her hand. It was her gaze. Cold, unwavering. When a prisoner dared to lift their eyes to meet hers, a subtle nod could decide their fate. One man remembered stumbling during a work detail. Exhausted, starving, he collapsed into the mud. She did not shout. She did not curse. She leaned slightly forward, whispered to the handler at her side, and released the dog. In seconds, the man's body was torn apart while others were forced to watch. Grese walked away without looking back. To the women under her authority, she was merciless. Survivors recalled being stripped naked in the freezing winter air, forced to stand in lines as she timed their endurance. Those who fell were kicked aside like broken dolls. Others were beaten until they could no longer rise. It was not punishment for crimes. It was spectacle, a demonstration of power. She relished these displays. Witnesses swore they saw her laugh, softly, almost playfully, after orchestrating suffering. That laugh, high and girlish, was remembered as more chilling than any scream. It revealed that the violence was not duty alone. It was enjoyment. Selections were her most feared role. Trains arrived daily, pouring thousands of men, women, and children onto the ramps. Prisoners lined up under the scrutiny of SS officers and auxiliaries. A point of the finger meant labor. Another meant the gas chamber. Grese was often present, standing among them, her youthful face belying the horror of the decisions. For those forced into her line of sight, she was fate itself. A simple gesture, casual and calm, condemned them to death. One survivor testified that she saw Grese order the shooting of a young girl who dared to whisper during roll call. Another remembered her unleashing dogs upon a mother who clutched her child too tightly, unwilling to let go even as guards demanded separation. The brutality was not always commanded by others. Many times it came from her initiative. She did not merely obey orders, she invented cruelties of her own. Even among the SS, she earned a reputation. Some male officers admired her ruthlessness, calling her the Iron Rose. Others kept their distance, unsettled by the ease with which she inflicted pain. She was respected, feared, and occasionally envied. In the warped hierarchy of Auschwitz, she thrived. By 1944, as the war raged outside the wire, Grese's control inside the camp only deepened. She strutted through the women's barracks with leather boots gleaming, often accompanied by her dogs. Survivors whispered her name before she appeared, terrified that even the sound of her footsteps could draw punishment. One woman recalled that silence would fall instantly, as though life itself held its breath when Grese entered. There was no safety, no predictability. She could walk past one group of prisoners without a word, only to single out another with deadly consequences. The randomness amplified the terror. No one could anticipate her mood. No one could appeal to her mercy, for she showed none. What makes her story haunting is not only the scale of her violence, but the contrast it embodied. A woman so young, so seemingly ordinary, yet behind the uniform and the smile was an abyss. Auschwitz became her stage, and cruelty her performance. Historians would later ask what drove her: ideology, ambition, or the intoxication of power. The survivors who endured her gaze cared little for the explanation. For them, she was the embodiment of evil itself. Each encounter with her carried the possibility of death. Each day under her command was another descent into fear. By the end of 1944, whispers of the Reich's collapse began to seep even into Auschwitz. Allied forces were advancing. Germany's future grew uncertain. Yet inside the barbed wire, Irma Grese remained unshaken. She continued her patrols, her punishments, her selections. Even as the empire she served crumbled, she clung to her role. For her, the camp was not merely duty, it was identity. In the ruins of Auschwitz, she had become something far more terrifying than a guard. She had become a symbol, a reminder that the face of cruelty can be young, can be beautiful, can smile while death unfolds at its feet. The war that had given Irma Grese her power was collapsing. By early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling under the weight of Allied advances. The Red Army pushed relentlessly from the east. British and American forces closed in from the west. One by one, the camps of death were abandoned. The empire of terror was disintegrating in fire and retreat. Inside Auschwitz, chaos spread. Orders were issued to evacuate. Prisoners were forced into death marches, trudging through snow and ice, thousands dying along the way. The camp that had made Irma Grese infamous was soon left behind. But she did not vanish into obscurity. She was reassigned to Bergen-Belsen, another camp already drowning in starvation, disease, and death. By then, her reputation preceded her. Survivors who had known her in Auschwitz recognized her instantly. The same cold stare, the same polished boots, the same aura of cruelty. Bergen-Belsen was different. There were no gas chambers here, no machinery of extermination on the same scale. But there was despair, endless and suffocating. Tens of thousands lay dying of typhus, hunger, and neglect, and Grese moved among them with the same detached authority. In April 1945, British forces advanced toward the region. The camp administration panicked. Many SS guards fled. Some discarded their uniforms and tried to melt into the civilian population. Others chose suicide rather than capture. But Grese stayed. Whether it was arrogance, denial, or simple miscalculation, she remained in Bergen-Belsen even as Allied soldiers closed in. When the British finally entered the camp, they were confronted with scenes of unimaginable horror. Piles of corpses lay unburied, bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors staggered through the mud, skeletal and hollow-eyed. For hardened soldiers, men who had fought through the blood of Europe, even they recoiled at what they found. And in the middle of it all, Irma Grese was taken into custody. She wore civilian clothing, hoping perhaps to disguise herself. But disguise was useless. Her face was already infamous. Her gait, her smile, her cold composure betrayed her identity. Prisoners pointed her out instantly. "That is her," they said. "The one from Auschwitz, the one with the dogs." The arrest was swift. There was no struggle. She did not cry out, did not beg. She was only 21 years old, yet already burdened with a legacy of terror. When questioned, she offered a single explanation. "I did my duty." The words echoed with chilling simplicity. In that moment, the world shifted. The woman who once commanded fear with a glance was now reduced to a prisoner herself. No longer the enforcer, no longer the predator. She was bound by Allied guards, surrounded by the wreckage of the system that had sustained her. The empire she served was gone. And in its ruins, she stood revealed, not as a loyal soldier, not as an obedient servant of orders, but as one of the most notorious symbols of cruelty born in the darkness of war. For the survivors, her capture was more than justice. It was vindication. They had endured the silence of the world while they suffered. Now, at last, one of their tormentors was in chains. The nightmare figure who had haunted the barracks of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen would face judgment. The fall of the Reich had swept countless villains into hiding. But Irma Grese, the so-called Hyena of Auschwitz, could not escape. Her story was reaching its climax, not in the shadows of the camps, but under the piercing light of a courtroom where every eye would watch and every crime would be exposed. September 1945. In the German city of Lüneburg, the British convened one of the most significant war crimes trials of the post-war era. 45 men and women from the SS stood accused of crimes committed at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. But among the rows of uniforms and hardened faces, it was one young woman who drew the gaze of every observer. Irma Grese, 21 years old, blonde hair neatly tied, a faint smile playing on her lips. She entered the courtroom, not with shame, but with composure. Dressed in a plain blouse, dark skirt, and heavy coat, she looked more like a secretary than a monster of the camps. Yet every witness pointed to her. Every testimony circled back to the same chilling presence. The hyena of Auschwitz. The blonde beast. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling as they relived the nightmares she had authored. One woman recalled how Grese ordered prisoners to strip in the bitter cold, laughing as they collapsed on the frozen ground. Another described how she unleashed dogs upon a man too weak to continue marching. Still others testified that she struck prisoners with her whip, sometimes without reason, sometimes for amusement. The consistency was striking. Story after story, name after name, built a wall of evidence too heavy to ignore. These were not isolated acts. They were patterns of cruelty, deliberate, repeated, personal. When asked to respond, Grese did not deny being present. She admitted serving at Ravensbrück, at Auschwitz, at Bergen-Belsen. She acknowledged her role as a guard, but her defense was chilling in its simplicity. "I only did my duty. I obeyed orders." The courtroom stirred with anger. The prosecutors pressed harder. They argued that what set Grese apart was not obedience, but initiative. She did not merely follow commands. She devised torments of her own. She took pleasure in suffering. She trained younger guards in methods of punishment. Her cruelty was not mechanical, it was willful. Witnesses supported this claim. Several remembered her soft laugh after moments of violence, a detail that pierced through the courtroom like a knife. It was the laugh, they said, that proved the truth. She enjoyed it. She relished the fear she caused. The judges listened. The prosecutors painted her as the embodiment of corruption unleashed by unchecked power. A young woman who, given authority in the machinery of death, revealed the darkest depths of the human soul. Week after week, the trial continued. Evidence was presented. Photographs from the camps shocked the world. Piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, the stench of horror captured on film. Against this backdrop, Grese's calm demeanor was unnerving. She showed no tears, no tremor in her voice, no remorse. Finally, the verdict came. Irma Grese was found guilty of crimes against humanity. She was sentenced to death by hanging. The youngest woman ever condemned in such trials, barely older than a girl, yet burdened with the weight of countless lives. For the survivors in the courtroom, the sentence brought a measure of justice. They had seen her stride through the camps untouchable, feared, unstoppable. Now she stood powerless before the judgment of the world. The smile still lingered on her lips, but it could no longer shield her. The press swarmed the story. Headlines blazed across Europe and beyond. The image of a young, attractive woman condemned to die for unspeakable crimes, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. How could someone so outwardly ordinary, even alluring, have become a symbol of monstrous cruelty? The question would echo long after the trial. But in the cold halls of justice, there was no mystery left. The court had spoken. The Hyena of Auschwitz would not escape her fate. The same authority she once wielded without mercy had now turned against her. And this time, there would be no smile, no boots echoing in the gravel, no prisoners forced into silence. Only the sound of a verdict carried by history. December 13th, 1945. In a cold, dim chamber at Hamelin Prison, the gallows stood ready. 3 prisoners were led down the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Among them was Irma Grese. She walked without resistance, without hesitation. No tears marked her face. No trembling betrayed fear. At just 22 years old, she was about to face the very fate she had delivered to countless others. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, was there to perform his duty. He had presided over hundreds of hangings, but Grese struck him as different. So young, so composed. When asked for her final words, she looked directly into his eyes. Her voice was steady, almost casual. "Quickly," she said. Only one word. No apology. No regret. The trap door opened. The body fell. The sound of wood striking echoed through the chamber. For a moment there was silence. The guards exchanged glances. No one spoke. The woman who had ruled the barracks of Auschwitz with cold authority now lay still, her power extinguished in an instant. News of her execution spread across Europe. Some saw it as justice served. Others were haunted by the image of her youth, the unsettling reminder that evil does not always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes it wears the face of a girl. Historians, psychologists, and journalists have studied her ever since. Was she a product of ideology, molded by the machinery of the Reich? Was she driven by ambition, hungry for power in a world that had offered her so little? Or was there something more disturbing? A natural inclination toward cruelty, awakened and unleashed by war? The answers remain elusive. What endures is the legacy of her actions. Survivors carried the memory of her laughter, her gaze, her smirk, long after the camps were liberated. For them, she was proof that the capacity for cruelty knows no boundaries of gender or age. That power, when unchecked, can transform even the seemingly ordinary into instruments of terror. Irma Grese's name remains etched in the history of atrocity. Not for commanding armies, not for wielding political influence, but for showing how a single individual, given authority in the wrong system, can become a symbol of evil that echoes for generations. Her execution closed one chapter, but the questions it raised remain. What makes a human being surrender compassion for cruelty? How fragile is the line between obedience and sadism? And what does her story reveal about the dangers of ideology when it takes root in the young and the impressionable? The hyena of Auschwitz is gone. Yet the shadows she cast still stretch across the memory of the 20th century. A warning carved in history. A reminder that the face of evil can be deceptively familiar. That in times of chaos, even the innocent-looking can become executioners. The gallows ended her life. But her story endures, etched into testimony, into photographs, into the memories of those who survived her gaze. A haunting echo from the darkest chapter of war.